go to those things that they have in place for recovery, ransomware authors likely would have already attacked that and or minimized it. Okay, so let's take a trip back down memory lane. Memory lane in the sense of we recognize it's 2021. We didn't just wake up yesterday and all of a sudden there's a ransomware attack. So where did this all really start? Well, the first instantiation of ransomware was the AIDS attack. This was back in 1989 by Dr. Joseph Kopp, right? And it was really based upon misleading people into thinking that what he was presenting was truly what it was, and it turned out to be something else. And what that was, talking about the AIDS pandemic, there was about 20,000 copies of a floppy disk that contained a survey talking about information about AIDS and what have you. Now, upon the 90th reboot within this with this floppy drive, it then replaced the autoexec.bat. And while it's not being used in modern versions of Windows that's Vista and newer, the autoexec.bat essentially at the time was used for startup programs and trying to depict which order that programs or files were actually located. So how this ransomware worked is it essentially hid the directories, renamed files on the C drive. So that way, when the autoexec.bat, you can almost think of it as kind of like an indexer in some respect, couldn't find them. Thus, the ransomware was actually in play. Now, at the time, they termed the fee a license fee, and it was either $189 or $378. But as we look at technology at the time, they wanted you to send this to a PO box in Panama, and it wanted to be a cashier's check or international money order, right? So automatically, we see that for that time, PO box probably made sense. Cashier's check certainly makes sense, but we may not see that type of tactic being used today. Now, this guy was ultimately arrested in the United Kingdom, and he tried to claim that the money that he got from it was going to be used for AIDS research, which it was not. So while minute in nature, this was the first instance of ransomware. And then as we moved on, we had cryptocurrency. And again, we're not talking about everything that ever happened, but just kind of hitting some big gates here. Cryptocurrency kind of came to light around 2008, and that's when we started hearing about Bitcoin. And although not everybody fully knew about it then, but as you know now, what's significant about Bitcoin is what it's anonymous, it's secure, it's not regulated, has all the ingredients for extortion of sorts. So guess what we started to see? We started to see people wanting to leverage that in some respect. So that brings us to Revitin. Revitin was first seen in 2012, and it exploited a vulnerability in the browser. And when it did so, it presented a page in which made you feel like it was legit. So in this case, this is showing like the FBI crime center, cybercrime division rather, and it's telling you, you've done all these things and all the other stuff, right? And in some cases, people are like, holy crap, I messed up. Because typically this ransomware operated based upon a vulnerability in the browser, but redirected from adult sites. So if somebody, they felt like they wasn't really supposed to be there, and now they're getting this FBI cybercrime division thing, they just wanted to go away very quickly. So this ransomware requested a payment of $300, and at the time, it was a money card that it wanted. So to try to instill fear in the user, it actually tried to impersonate law enforcement. It locked the user out of the system. And then guess what? Later on within the ransomware, it also tried to steal passwords and what have you. Now, this was all easily to remove once you fully understood it. It was simply a registry key that could be removed. But again, when we talk about lockers versus crypto, if you will, this was one of those lockers where we're just trying to prevent you from actually accessing it. And guess what? There's multiple versions of it. So here's another one, NSA Internet Surveillance Program, right? PRISM, if you will. Again, trying to instill fear in the user so that way they feel inclined to pay the ransom, okay? We had Crypto Locker in 2013, and this one typically spread through email, and it sought rather to encrypt user files. There were about 70 types that it actually looked for. And this was kind of where we started to see the first instantiation of using crypto or cryptors, if you will, for locking access to files. And at the time, it was 2048. Now, it used the DGA in the sense of who it talked back to or where you should send stuff. And at the time, 250,000 is who it affected. And that was large in scale. And even today, in some respect, that could be considered large. Now, this thing propagated over the Game Over Zeus botnet, but it was taken down just about a year or some change later by the DOJ, and those keys were recovered. But we noticed that this one is starting to talk about Bitcoin. We'll start to see that common theme throughout. 2014, we seen torrent lockers. This was mainly in Australia, New Zealand, but it spread also through email. It sought to harvest email contacts, if you will, on a system in which it was infecting. So then it will look to propagate to people on your contact list. Up front, it also looked to get rid of those volume shadow copies. So even when you realized that the system was being encrypted, your initial source of backup was already going to be removed. At the time, demanded 500 in Bitcoin, but guess what? Had to be paid within 3 days, and each person received something different. So we start to see that a little bit more customization in this. Tesla Crypt 2015, common theme, email, vulnerable servers. This one, 185 extension types, which is over double from the previous one. This one also sought to go after files or items that were linked to games. So if you were a PC gamer, again, if I'm writing ransomware and I'm encrypting files on your system, I want to encrypt the things that render your system inoperable. I want to encrypt the data that's most important to you. And in this case, if I'm on a PC in which somebody's playing PC games, if I can affect that data, that may be the very thing that they most care about. This ransom 550 in Bitcoins. And guess what? If you didn't pay, it was going to increase to almost double that, a little over double that after a week. Now, in 2016, they moved on, they decommissioned, suspected, they just went on and worked on different variants of ransomware, but actual key was released of sorts from those people. But it's kind of interesting where people are doing this for financial gain. And as they work on different projects, we see stuff like this where like, hey, we don't even want to manage this anymore. We're going to go ahead and give everybody their information to get their data back. But essentially have no fear. We're working on other stuff. So I'm sure we'll meet again. All right, so we see locking in 2016. This is where we started to see Office products being used. And what's interesting here is that when you look at the snippet there or the screenshot, we see in red text, enable macro if the encoding is incorrect, right? This is one of those things where even if you had your system set up to where macros was disabled by default, they just put some googly garbage there to make it look like it's almost encrypted. And the reason why it's not showing in the correct sense is because macros is disabled. And if it can get you, the user, client side, to actually enable macros, then the code that's underlined within that docx can actually execute. All right. Again, they're looking for the user to actually interact with it, and they were getting a lot of people at the time. Right. So this was distributed via a botnet, and at the time, over 5 million devices. Now, what's interesting is it did not affect Russian machines based upon the language pack. So if you're doing some form of analysis, if it's affecting every other language, but it seeks to not affect a specific language, then that leads you to believe or leads you to think a particular place of origin. The ransom, 5,000 or 10,000, it varied a little bit. But what's very interesting is that this specifically targeted users unknowing how macros and how the Office products work. So even when defenses are in play, hey, go ahead and allow us in, right? And a lot of people were running, were victims to this. All right. So when we look at this timeline, it's going to spread through an email. Hey, I'm going to send you a document. Person's going to open that thing. Person's going to be tricked to open or enable macros. A binary is going to actually be downloaded, right? Because within that Office document, it's essentially code for a downloader. And once that macro is enabled, Then it's going to actually download the payload being a ransomware, and then we're going to actually encrypt the machine. Okay, so we see the ransom letter that's rendered for it. It's very interesting. Ransomware is going to give you some form of a letter. They're almost entertaining in some respect. All right, so Petya 2016. This one sought to rewrite the master boot record. Right, so when it initially affected the machine, it infected the MBR, it forced a reboot, and then it triggered essentially the MFT being encrypted. As it was doing the encrypting after the reboot, it had a fake check disk that was running, making the user feel like it was doing some form of repair to the machine because something happened, but instead it was actually encrypting the master file table. So this blocked access to the whole entire machine, not just specific files on the disk as previous ransomware had done. The ransom in this case was roughly about $300, and it certainly varied. And looking at the target list or who was affected most, we see Ukraine was affected substantially more than everybody else. We won't go into a history lesson about kind of what was going on during that time, but this is certainly interesting. All right, so we had WannaCry come in 2017. This was super huge and will forever go down in history, much like a lot of other ransomware attacks. But propagated via an SMB exploit, so Eternal Blue, and I think we got a slide actually coming up about it a little bit. But that's how it propagated throughout systems using SMB v1 and exploit or vulnerability within it. And we're talking billions of dollars in damages, primarily Windows 7. Luckily, there was a researcher who was doing analysis of the code, realized that there was a kill switch domain in the code, and then went and registered it. So then we were able, or the world was able to kind of neutralize that attack. But this kind of goes down in history as the biggest outbreak in history when it comes to ransomware. Again, what's interesting, the price. Hey, I want you to pay, and I want you to hurry up and do it now. So if you take advantage of the introductory price, if you will, $300. But if you don't take advantage of it, $600 within 3 days. So again, the quicker they can get people to pay, the better for the ransomware authors, right? The longer people have to think about it, the more options they start to realize they might have. Right? So if I can impede on your thoughts and your feelings, getting you to making a knee-jerk reaction to go ahead and pay and get this over with, the better. I'm almost making you, or they're almost making you feel like you're getting a break. Right? Pay me now, $300. If you don't pay me now, it's going to go up. All right. So WannaCry, breaking it down. 17010 is Eternal Blue. So taking advantage of SMB v1, they're able to access the machine. They set up a fake process. This fake process downloads a number of other things, and then essentially the data on the machine is going to be encrypted. It's going to end in WN cry for WannaCry. What's really significant here is this SMB vulnerability was huge, and it's still huge in my opinion. So combining the payload, the ransomware, with that delivery mechanism allowed it to just go out and hit machines as opposed to emailing it, right? And waiting on people to open the email, execute the thing that's attached there or navigate out to the link. This was essentially scan and exploit, if you will. So that's what had it or enabled it to be a substantially large intrusion. All right, so Ryuk, seen it in 2018, still very prevalent today. Like actually within the last, today, still very prevalent. Targets organizations with critical assets because again, if it's a critical asset, you're not gonna wanna leave it offline for a period of time. And they want to be able to impede on that. Because it's critical, there's a high likelihood that you're gonna pay it. So the ransom is somewhere between 100K to 500K, and the delivery is gonna be through phishing, Emotech, TrickBot. Emotech, TrickBot, you typically see those together, and we're talking about downloaders and Trojans that were essentially a repurpose of malware, right? When we see Ryuk, Emotech, TrickBot, it's typically done in the fashion of an assembly line, right? So there's people who might be using Emotech to gain access. Once that access is given, it's passed over to another group of people who might be using TrickBot to do um, expansion, lateral movement, and then they're going to utilize TrickBot to actually download Ryu, right? So very criminal focused, very criminal in nature. And this actually kind of depicts that. Phishing email, some form of office document. PowerShell is going to go out, of course, download Emotech. Emotech is a stage 1 downloader, is then going to do a number of things, but largely is going to grab TrickBot. TrickBot is going to set the stage for Ryuk and that communication back to the C2 server. Ryuk is going to be that payload. So we see a daisy chain of sorts, and likely, highly likely, not one entity that's doing all 3 parts of this. Highly likely, it's a multi-tiered entity where it's like an assembly line. Now, there was an intrusion that I was responding to that actually this whole scenario kind of played out. And we've seen where Emotech, TrickBot, Ryuk, within an hour to 2, they've encrypted a large portion of an enterprise. But in the instance in which I responded to, they were still in the aspect of trying to laterally move, but they had not executed the Ryuk payload. They certainly had dropped TrickBot, but not executed the Ryuk payload. So the organization actually pretty got lucky in that respect. All right, Maze ransomware, first seen last year, or excuse me, the year before last, 2019. Emails, exploit kits, post-op compromise. It's targeting nearly every sector of the industry. What's interesting about this is they've taken shaming an organization to a new level. These actors maintain a public-facing website, and you're either going to pay the ransom and get the key to get your data back, or they've already stolen the data, and then they're going to release that data for people who don't want to pay. So you're either going to pay, and they may give your data back and release your data, or you're not going to pay, and then we're just going to essentially blackmail, shame you, what have you. Right? This is taking ransomware to a whole new level. All right, now, while we talked about a number of ransomware variants from 1989 up to present, we just don't have enough time to talk to them all. There's always a new variant coming out. There's always, an instantiation of something being built, right? So when we look at how many variations are there, there's a lot. So back to really the talk. The talk again, invisible war, we're looking at the ransomware battle. Well, what's war versus battle, all that good stuff? Well, I look at what Webster says. Webster says war is essentially engaging in a war is a verb. They talk from a noun perspective, a state of armed conflict between different nations or states or different groups within a nation or state. When we look at battle, verb, fight or struggle tenaciously to achieve or resist something. Now, a sustained fight between large organized armed forces. Now, while these aren't necessarily, these ransomware authors, they're not necessarily armed in the sense of kinetic weapons as we would see it. They're armed in the sense of malicious code. And the people that they're attacking are now being succumbed to that, and they're being forced into a long-term war, and in some cases, individual battles. And this, as you see, 1989 to present, has substantially just grown, and it continues to get worse and worse. For every new technology we have, digital technology, then becomes another instance in which somebody could abuse it and take control of it. So knowing that we're engaged in conflict, every day I go to work, I'm trying to defend my organization, just like as you go to work, you're trying to defend your organization. In some cases, we'll work together to defend against the actors. What does this really mean for us? What are these numbers? Well, from the FBI, we see this. 2015, as far as back as I can go for the FBI, 8,000 complaints with nearly 275 million in losses, right? And then we just fast forward to 2019, 467,000 complaints with nearly 3.5 billion in losses. Now, their 2020 report hasn't come out yet. It typically comes out around the middle to the end of February. But if I were a betting person, I would bet that number would not have decreased, but instead increased based upon what I've seen or what we're all seeing from 2015 to 2019. Here's some more staggering numbers from Soho from the perspective of 2020 numbers. So when surveying 5,000 cyber professionals, 51% of them were hit with ransomware. 51% of 5,000 cyber professionals who were surveyed were hit with ransomware. Wow. 35 of those businesses, right? It took them 7 days or more to regain access. Interesting. The average cost on a business, $133,000. Now, depending on what organization you work for, that may or may not hurt. And I shouldn't say it may not hurt because it's going to hurt in some respect. There's some organizations that cannot, they don't have that. And that will essentially take them under. Phishing emails from 2017 have increased by 109%. And it's only going to continue to increase. And of all the all the malware attacks, 56% of them, over half, were based on ransomware. 99% of ransoms were paid in Bitcoin. Now, this is all based upon what we know, because not every organization is just running to the mill to publicly release that, one, they were hit with ransomware, and two, what the ransom was, and really three, whether they paid it or not. All right, so here's some more stuff. Average incident took about 9.6 days. Now, in cases where people paid the ransom, the decryptor was supplied 94% of the time. 94% of the time. You mean to tell me somebody infiltrated my network, encrypted my data, we made a conscious decision to pay the ransom so we can get the data back. In 6% of the time, we didn't even get the decryptor? What are you going to do about it? Right? Further, data successfully recovered 91% of the time, excuse my double duh there, with a decryptor. So we have people who paid the ransom, got a decryptor, and then of those people, 91% of the time, the decryptor worked. You're not going to go back to them and be like, hey, man, I tried it. It didn't work. Can you give me some more screenshots? Can you RDP in and walk me through this process? All right. So you're already playing with fire from the minute somebody gains that access. And there is a new organization that falls victim to ransomware every 13 seconds, right? And as I talk about, not everybody's running to the front of the line or trying to get on the evening news to tell us about the ransomware attack. Less than 25% of people actually report them above, regulatory guidance or what they have reporting requirements, right? In the sense of openly coming out and saying it. All right. So when we look at United States industries, and we're just talking a little bit from 2020, we're talking 966 organizations. 11.7 of those were state and municipal governments and agencies. 79% were healthcare providers. Healthcare. Why healthcare? Let me think about healthcare at large. People are probably going to die. Okay, yeah, that's all I can really think about from that perspective. And then when I think about it from 2020, we're already dealing with this pandemic, right? So that's target infrastructure. 9.3 of them were universities, colleges, school districts. That's minute when I think about healthcare. Now, the outcomes, substantial. Emergency patients had to be redirected to hospitals. I don't know about you. I look at the news and it seems like every night I'm hearing no more emergency rooms here. We're going to lose out. We got a couple of beds left here. And then we're dealing with stuff like ransomware when that comes into play. Holy crap. Medical records were inaccessible and in some cases permanently lost. Surgical procedures were canceled. 911 services interrupted. Badge scanners and building access ceased to work. Schools could not access data about students, medications, or allergies. That is cold-blooded. But from a person whose main purpose is financial gain, criminal financial gain, they care less about it. That seems more like a you problem versus a them problem. Let's look at a couple of instances. So from state governments, we have Tillamook County in Oregon, January 2020. Ransom of $300,000, they paid it. It affected all their internal systems. San Miguel County, New Mexico, in February, $250,000, they paid it, affected their networking and their backup servers. City of Florence, Alabama, ransom of $378,000. They negotiated it down to $291,000. Listen to that. $378,000. They negotiated down to 291. Either way, the attacker is winning. What was the effect? What was affected, right? The city email system was shut down. Recovery costs and loss of business, although they negotiated down to 291,000, exceeded 17 million. Exceeded 17 million, right? City of Lafayette, 445,000, they paid it. They failed to recover using their backups. I explicitly say that because they initially did not want to pay it and they tried to recover. But this goes back to just good old IT. When I'm doing backups, we probably need to make sure backups actually work. We need to probably make sure that although we think we're doing backups, that backups are actually done, right? All of those basic hygiene type stuff were failed in this case. The attacker didn't even try to delete the backups. Because they did not have backups, they were a little bit in a pickle and they were forced to kind of do this. This affected city email and phone services. Huntsville, right? I don't know what the ransom was. Affected schools around the city, right? Compromised various data, right? This is big. This is hitting right there at home for you guys. Hall County, Georgia, unknown ransom disabled databases with voter registration information, right? Again, you just got to hit a person or an entity at such a time where it's a no-fail mission or their bottom dollar and bottom business objective is on the line, right? You're taking advantage of people's misfortunes, and that's what ransomware is all about. All right, so still looking at some examples. Here's some private sectors, healthcare, some education, and this isn't necessarily just the US. So we have TravelX. This actually started in December 2019 and kind of just took the toll to April. So ransomware of 2.3, they ended up paying that. That was not the initial ransom. This is what they negotiated it down. Currency exchange was crippled. So again, talk about forcing people and forcing their arm. Now, the result of this is they were forced to cut over 1,000 jobs, right, following the incident. But I guess they're surviving. I don't get to see all their internal stuff, but certainly it affected them if they had to turn around and cut jobs. So we have a law firm, initial ransom of 21 million, right? We got all these lawyers and they're talking about law and ethics and everything else. Meanwhile, they're like standing strong. So the ransomware attackers, guess what they said? Cool story, bro. I'm going to raise it to 42,000. I don't actually know if they paid or not, but the actors, the ransomware actors, still trying to force the law firm's hand, release data about celebrities that this law firm was caring for or representing. We have Columbia College, unknown ransom amount, right? This actor was going to sell students' information on the dark web. Nobody wants that. University of Utah, 457,000, they paid it. It affected 2% of their systems, but 457,000. And the school, and I'll misquote them here, but they said something to the nature that while 2% is small, they went ahead and paid it because they didn't want to stretch it out and they didn't want to take the chance of other things happening. That's an interesting approach. I'm bleeding on my hand a little bit and I don't know if I'm going to die, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut the hand off or tend to the hand. And not saying that's wrong. Every organization has to make those decisions. I don't envy them. And this is what we publicly know, not necessarily what is fully true in nature. Then we have University Hospital. I didn't get the location in Germany. I don't even know what this ransom amount is, but it affected 30 servers, crashed systems. The hospital was forced to turn patients away. And as they did so, en route to another hospital, a patient actually ended up dying. Right? So when we talk about, and they express a little bit of remorse, but when we talk about ransomware and people not really caring, it's all about financial gain, we see it in play. Okay. So you may be listening and you're like, man, this is bad. Ransomware is bad. But I wish I had the skills to develop it. And if that's you, okay, there's other people out there for sure. And for those people, there's this. There's ransomware for the less skilled, right? So there's open source ransomware, essentially that you could fork and actually download and use. And then there's ransomware as a service. So we have stuff like Philadelphia, where they actually have a YouTube video. We have GangCrab, which was substantial. They have since kind of died off. We have NetWalker, who has ads for specific skill sets, almost like you're managing a data center and you need, maybe a person who does servers, you need a DevOps person, you need a net engineer, if you will. They have ads out there for specific skill sets for different parts of the intrusion vector or the intrusion phase, if you will, for ransomware. That's interesting. Then you have Satan, right? So Satan's kind of like a choose your adventure when it comes to ransomware. So you can pick the amount, you can put your Bitcoin address in, and you can talk about a number of other things. But hey, guess what? Because that UI is being provided to you, the authors of the program, platform, if you will, they get to keep 30% right off the rip, right? So again, ransomware is so accessible. Now, thus far, we've been really talking about it from a Windows perspective. So you're like, man, I use Mac. I'm a Mac fanboy, and that's okay. I'm actually on a Mac right now, so stay strong. But it isn't just a Windows problem, right? We're incorrect in that. So here's some other quick examples of ransomware for other platforms. So there's Linux Encoder, which kind of targets web servers, and they charge 1 Bitcoin per file. As we know, when we look at web servers, traditionally it's going to be some form of NIX. From a Mac perspective, there is Patcher. This seems to mask itself as a patch for popular applications. The ransomware is like $300. And then there's Key Ranger. This is baked into an affected version of transmission. You can think transmission is kind of like a peer-to-peer. They actually compromised this certificate, so they were actually able to sign the compromised version based upon that stolen certificate. There's iOS ransomware, which isn't really true ransomware, but it certainly meets the intent based upon the definition. And this locks your phone based upon compromised credentials for your iCloud. There's Simple Locker that essentially encrypts your mobile device, because we know at the core what the Android operating system is. And this is going to communicate to some C2 via Tor services. So essentially go through Tor. Now, if that's not enough for you, right, and you want a little bit more, there's this. There's ransomware of the future, the Internet of Things. Everything is plugged up. Everything has a presence on the interwebs. And while it provides some level of convenience, it doesn't necessarily provide the same level of security, right? And also, when you look at things like intrusion detection systems or IPSs, how often are you actually seeing that traffic? Are you regulating it? How often, when you're patching your operating system, are you even looking for patches for some of these IoT things? Are you using IoT things that are even still supported by the company, right? And if somebody was poking at it, would you be able to see it? Now, this is what makes IoT awesome, right? Because as we look at this, we're talking pacemakers, insulin pumps, automobiles, your house, everything. This is an awesome attack surface to then be able to pivot. So within DEF CON 24, the future of ransomware is really now, because this is happening now, right? DEF CON 24, somebody was able to compromise a thermostat, right? And they presented a message. They were essentially locking it out until that ransomware was paid. They were also able to affect and change the temperature. Now, this was all at DEF CON. We kind of know what happens there. But this is not so uncommon where it's a one-off instance, right? Then we have stuff like this. We have smart TVs, underlying OS, if you will, is Android. So somebody was able to actually compromise a LG TV, present a ransomware message, blocking them, locking them from actually accessing their TV as is. The ransomware was for $500. People who were infected were trying to reach out to LG for assistance. LG is like, hey, I can help you, but it's going to cost you $340 before we give you the reset steps. So you're sitting here like, I can pay the $500, or I can pay LG $340 to then get the reset steps. And if you're using an LG TV, you're probably like, why would you even charge me, LG? I'm just not going to go and use you anymore. So guess what happened? LG actually provided those reset steps, so that way people didn't have to worry about it. They knew they were going to start to lose customers. All right, and then we have a pen tester at Avast that actually was able to gain access to a coffee maker. Now, some of the effects, they could trigger the coffee maker to turn on the burner. Okay, it's a little bit scary. Dispense water, spin the bean grinder, beep repeatedly, right? Nobody wants to hear that. And they could display a ransomware message. Essentially, to stop this, they had to unplug it. Now, you can barely see it there, but essentially it's saying, hey, you want your machine back? Here's a bit.ly link for you to go to. And then from there, they would have instructions on how to actually regain access to the machine. All right, so when we talk about the future of ransomware, and we see a couple of things happening now, the use of IoT is only going to continue to grow. By 2025, we see those numbers substantially larger in some respect, and we can continue to see them grow. We are in a digital age where everything needs to be plugged up for accessibility, convenience, you have it, and the targeting of those machines are only going to get worse, specifically when they provide some high-level form of function in an organization or have some form of data that affects people's lives or their bottom dollar. Now, not even talking about it from a ransomware perspective, there's also the aspect of gaining access to an IoT and then pivoting into an internal network or other aspects of the network. So IoT at large is kind of concerning for those two reasons. All right, so now if you're like, man, this is a lot. I've seen Windows, I've seen Nix, seen a number of things, IoT, holy crap, we're screwed. We're not really screwed, right? We do have to go through the 5 stages of ransomware, right? If you're hit with it. So first one is denial, right? You're in denial that you were actually even a victim of ransomware. And then once you come to grips with that, then there's anger, right? You're pissed that you were even succumb to that. And then you start to realize, okay, well, being mad's not going to help me get my data back, if you will. So I need to figure out how to do that. And you want to bargain, right, with the individuals or figure out how to do that. And if that doesn't work, or even if that does work, there's still depression that sinks in, because now you're trying to worry about the business. You're worried about your job, or even if you didn't actually get the data back, all of those things are hugely important. And even if you did get the data back, people are certainly going to have questions into your security posture of how that happened. Okay, and at some point, you're just going to accept it and largely pay that fee or not pay that fee. All right, so here's some mitigation techniques from our friends at the FBI and CISA. And largely speaking, they're not things that we haven't heard of. They make sense, but largely people don't do the most common things, and this is why we find ourselves in positions we find ourselves in. So we want to be able to take regular backups. We don't want to store those backups on the same network in which we're backing up. We absolutely want to test the backups to make sure that they actually work. We want to not click links that we don't know about. I know we all know that if we're in this profession, it's us trying to prevent people with our organization who don't necessarily know that or can't see the signs. So we want to be able to filter or identify when such things have happened. We want to ensure that if you're using on-prem services, that you have some form of defense in depth. That gets a little bit crazier when we're talking about the cloud, but we want to look at application control, least privilege, all of those things that make it a little bit more difficult, even if somebody did click a link, for malicious code or malicious logic to actually execute. We'll want to prevent people from reusing passwords or even just changing it from password 01 to password 02. We want to largely enforce it to be a lot stronger than what it is and rotate those things quite often. Now, when we look at keeping our operating systems up to date, we want to do this from a trusted source, do validation, and we don't want this to be a manual process because that induces human error. And in some cases, humans just decide not to do it. Okay, from a mitigations and detection standpoint, we got a couple of things that are out there. There's Know Before. Know Before. It's a free ransomware simulator for Windows 7 and newer, and you can download this, execute it on your machine, and based upon the security posture of your machine, it will come back with a number of scenarios and tell you how many files would have been encrypted had it been malware, and then give you some recommendations of it. So there's nothing better from a simulation standpoint than this. And at the time of this this recording, if you will, this presentation, 16 scenarios. So they continuously are trying to add to it. Then there's no more ransom. This helps with the identification of ransomware. Not all the time when we're hit with ransomware does the ransom note say, "Hey, we're you know, John Bob or whatever, or we're this." Or even looking at the extension for the encrypted file, could we be able to tell? So no more ransom helps with that identification. And in some cases, there's decryptors. They have roughly 120 or so decryptors that are available. And this is maintained by over 100 entities. So while I might be in the military, and you know, there might be certain people who might target the military, there might be other organizations that target other aspects of the government or other industries, but largely speaking, when we come together, we can combat this together. All right, so we also have ID ransomware. It helps with the identification of ransomware, just like the previous one, and they have roughly 800 ransomware variants. There's vaccine that when we run vaccine, it will actually look for indications of people trying to delete the volume shadow copy, which is a TTP of ransomware. And when it does that, it looks for the parent process and it terminates them, right? So we're essentially thwarting the ransomware attack in some respect, a part of it, by using vaccine. Now, vaccine intercepts that, but if we're legitimately trying to do something with the volume shadow copy, it could mistake us as somebody who's trying to attack it. And we need it to be running to then be able to do that interception. But it is a tool, a capability to help us in our endeavors. And it's free. It's a really good project as well. All right. So when we look at the pyramid of pain, we know when we're trying to do things based upon hashes, those are trivial. Right? IP addresses, those are easy for an attacker or an actor to change. But the TTPs of how they actually do things, that's tough. That's tough for a person to change. That's a genetic makeup. That's a mindset that has to shift. Right? So that's where we want to attack it. And the best way we can start to do that is to utilize some form of an attack chain and understand how these ransomware variants work and seek to get ahead of them to change their TTPs, right? So we can use something that's very simple as this, or we could do something a little bit larger, but largely speaking, they're gonna all need to have some form of initial access. That may be hard for us to really get ahead of. We do know at some point, they're going to want to spread laterally. Why? Because they're not necessarily just trying to, special use cases, trying to encrypt one system, but really a subset or an enterprise of systems. All right. So as we bring it to a close here, here's some reasons why you should pay. Well, the FBI has gone on record and said it is the easiest path to recover, essentially to pay. You could get your files back, and I put a maybe in there because recall when we talked about that percentage in the 90s in which it actually worked, but there was still about less than 10% that it did not work for. And in some cases, it could be cheaper in the long run than what it would be to rebuild infrastructure, bring in people, investigative stuff, cost to the business, right? So a couple of reasons why we should actually pay. Now, conversely, here's some stuff, or here's some reasons why we should not pay. CISA and FBI clearly say no, right? Yes, the FBI clearly said yes, it is the easiest path on the previous slide, but FBI has also clearly said no, so there's some contradiction, if you will. And it seems cheaper, but it really is not, depending on the business, and not really depending on the business, rather. Disclosure is not cheap, right? There's a target on your back. You pay once, you'll probably pay again. When you're hit with ransomware, that doesn't actually tell you how somebody got in there. So if you don't ever plug those holes, you still become a victim later on. And because you paid once, somebody's going to come back to you. There's no guarantee that you're even going to get your files back. We talked about this with that decryptor not working, or even them not providing that ransomware key. And at large, the big reason is because the criminals, they're going to win. right? We're feeding into what they're actually want. So that brings me to the end. I appreciate your time. I'm Fernando Tomlinson, and this presentation is at my website as listed there. I do some development, although we didn't really talk about any of my development in this presentation. But if you're interested in that, I'm a big person on GitHub. And if you want to connect with me, like-minded, and just want to converse, I'm on Twitter Sphere. So with that, I'll pause for questions. If there's no questions, then I'll pass it back over to the moderator.